When we think about our senators and our representatives, our minds typically go straight to Washington. The members of the U.S. Congress are the ones that we hear the most about. We see them on TV, we'll read about them in the news, but those are not the only senators and representatives that we have. Every state has them too, and we elect them to go make state laws at the state capitol. My name is Demircan, coming to you from my home in Connecticut. We're just 10 miles away from Hartford, where our state representatives and state senators convene to make laws. Today, we're going to be talking about state legislatures in Connecticut and elsewhere, what they look like, what they do, and how they do it. Welcome to this Big Little Lesson. As I mentioned before, today's lesson is on the state legislature, which includes the state senate and state house. So there is a lot to cover in this lesson. So just to break it down before, we're going to start out by speaking about what a state legislature is and how that looks different from the U.S. Congress, which is the federal legislature. Then we're going to look at how these state legislatures look different depending on which of the 50 states you're in. Then we're going to look at the Connecticut General Assembly, which is our state legislature, look at who makes it up, where they meet, what the breakdown is. And then finally, we're going to stay on Connecticut and we're going to go through the process of how a bill becomes a law. And I'm going to give you kind of the bystander's guide to understanding how this process works. So you can follow it, you can understand it, you know what's going on. If we look back at this handy guide of all of the elected offices we vote on in Connecticut, we see right here our state senate and state house of representatives are in the legislative branch at the state level. And we notice that it looks pretty similar to what's right above it at the federal level. Again, you have a Senate and you have a House of Representatives. So you may be wondering how exactly these are different from each other. We're going to break that down right now. So by legislative, that means lawmaking. And both of these bodies, both on the federal level and on the state level, make laws. They're bodies of elected representatives. They get together, they go through the process of introducing what is a bill that goes through a process and then becomes a law. All laws are made from these legislators, whether it's a federal law made at the federal level or a state law made at the state level. It has to go through these individuals. And the biggest difference between federal and state is pretty self-explanatory. It is just the scope that the laws cover. So federal legislature makes federal laws. They're laws that wherever you are, whether it be Alaska, whether it be Iowa, whether it be Florida, the law will apply. But a state legislature will make laws that only apply to that state and the residents of that state. So every state is going to have a state legislature, every state is going to have state laws, and it's going to be different depending on where you are. And finally, we have this distinction between the Senate and the House, which exists at both the federal level and also the state level. In the United States, one big thing that we have is a bicameral legislature. That means we have two chambers. These are the two chambers. And basically, the important thing here is you have different representatives in each of the chambers. You actually have a different number of representatives in each chamber, as we'll see. And you need both of these chambers to agree before a bill can go forward and become a law. It just adds another layer to the process to make sure that one group just doesn't go crazy and go passing all of these laws. It keeps them in check by having both that need to agree before it can go forward. And as an American, as a voter, we have representation at all of these levels. So as we covered in an earlier lesson, we have 2 U.S. senators, 2 sent from every state. You vote on both of them, and everybody has 1 U.S. representative depending on the district that's drawn. The U.S. is drawn into 435 districts, and you're going to belong to one of them. At the state level, you just have 1 of each. So there is a state Senate map, and there's a state House of Representatives map, and you're just going to be within 1 of each district, so you have 2 state legislators. The exception would be if you're in Nebraska. That state legislature is comprised only of 1 chamber that's called unicameral, and they just have a state senate. I would make a Nebraska joke, but I figure that would be a little bit too corny, and we'll just move on. State legislatures don't look identical across states. There are a few key differences between them that we're going to cover, but as I mentioned earlier, every state is going to have a state legislature, and that state legislature is going to be the uniquely responsible body that is concerned with making state laws. So even the name will differ depending on what state you're in. Now, the state legislature is the general name for what this body is, but in most states, they actually will just call it a state legislature. They'll say things like the Minnesota State Legislature. That is just the name of it. In some states, including Connecticut, where I am, we call it a General Assembly. So the body that is comprised of both houses is generally called the General Assembly. The Connecticut General Assembly is what we call it. And in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, they call that the General Court. Now, down here we see the state senate is going to be the state senate in every state. That upper house in Nebraska, that only house, that is the state senate. But the state House of Representatives can have a few different names. Again, in most states, they'll call it the State House of Representatives or the State House. But in certain states, they call it the State Assembly, the California State Assembly. You also have the House of Delegates, like in Maryland and Virginia, the Virginia House of Delegates. And in New Jersey, they just call this lower house the General Assembly. So they'll call the entire structure the state legislature, the New Jersey State Legislature, and then they have a New Jersey General Assembly, which is just that one lower house that exists in addition to the state senate. Next up, we have the location. Each state legislature is going to be located in that state's capital, and also in that state's capital. So if you're wondering why that sounds so redundant, we need to note the distinction between state capital spelled with an A and state capital spelled with an O. If it's capital with an A, that is the city. Every state is going to have a certain city that is a capital, and that's where all government offices are going to be based. There's also the state capitol with an O, and that is the actual building itself that the government offices are based in. So just to think about Washington, the capital of our country. Washington, D.C. is the U.S.'s capital with an A. It is a city. And then within that, you have the U.S. Capitol with an O. And that is this building, this domed building, where the U.S. Congress, which is the federal legislature, will convene. Now, you should know what your state capital is. If you don't, this map will show all of them. In each state, the one city that's marked is the capital. So that is where the state legislature in any of these states is going to meet. You're going to have state legislators who are from districts all across the state, but they come to convene in the state capital, just like our U.S. representatives and senators come from all over the country, and they convene in Washington, D.C. Next up, the size and the term length are going to be different across states. It's not like there is a fixed number or a fixed number of years that each term is. That's really all up to the state to decide, which is pretty nice. Every state is allowed to structure its state legislature in whatever way it wishes. So we can just see here, I'm only showing the first few states in the alphabet, but you see a varying number of members of the Senate and the House. The term length will always be 4 or 2 years. Sometimes the Senate, which is the upper house, will be 4, and the House of Representatives will be 2. Sometimes they're both 4, sometimes they're both 2. Here in Connecticut, we see they're both 2. But one thing I want to point out is this number. If we look at Colorado versus Connecticut, Colorado does have a substantially bigger population than Connecticut does, but we can see that the number of members of the state Senate are almost equal. There's only a difference of 1 member, despite the big difference in our population. However, in the House, Colorado, which is much bigger, only has 65 members, whereas Connecticut, a pretty small state, has 151. So that shows there's no real pattern that you can really follow. It's just a matter of the state deciding how they want to divide things up. Another big distinction that we have is whether the legislature is going to meet on a full-time or part-time basis, or if it's going to be somewhere in the middle. Again, there are not really fixed categories. Every state is going to have the right to do it in whatever way they wish. A few differences between the full-time and the part-time is the actual time commitment. So in the full-time legislatures, the legislators that we elect are going to be working for most of the year, and they're going to get paid for a full-time job. In the part-time legislatures, the legislators are going to be working on a part-time basis. They're going to be compensated to some degree, but the salary is not going to be one that you can really live off of completely. And they're always going to have other jobs that they do in addition. Another reason is because the sessions are going to be shorter in the part-time legislatures. They're going to just be a few months rather than most of the months of the year in the full-time. And then also the staffs, the standing staffs are going to be different as well. So the legislatures are not going to be comprised only of the elected representatives. You're also going to have just employees of the government who work in different offices that ensure that the process is run smoothly. They're not actually creating the laws, but they're working to ensure that they can get created. Now we're going to take a moment to learn a little bit more about the Connecticut General Assembly, which is the Connecticut State Legislature, and look at the buildings, look at the people, and understand kind of in more practical terms how this looks. So here first we have the state capitol, capitol spelled with an O, and this is the remarkable domed building. You can see it off of the highway, and it is a very old building. You actually go on tours here when you're in elementary school. They like to show it off, and it deserves to be shown off. But this isn't where everything happens. There is also this building right next to it, which is the Legislative Office Building. And the legislators will have their offices here, and they'll meet in groups here. It's not like all of the work is going to be done in the Capitol. We're going to see why they go to the Capitol. There is this cool underground connector, kind of like at an airport, that you can take to go from one building to the other, which is really fun to do. So now to take a look at the statistics that are unique to the Connecticut General Assembly. First up, we see the number of seats. We did see this a little bit earlier, but we have 36 members of the state Senate and 151 in the House of Representatives. And if we look at the makeup, we see that Democrats do control both of these. We have more Democrats than Republicans, and that usually is the case in Connecticut. Back in 2016, the state Senate was tied, so we had 18 and 18 together. House of Representatives has always kind of been skewed towards the Democrats. The term length is going to be 2 years for both of them, so every 2 years, which is every even-numbered year, we're going to have all of the state senators and all of the state representatives up for re-election. And there's no term limit, so this can really go on. We have some who have been in there for decades, and there is no cap on how many terms that they can serve before they have to step down. And in terms of the session, we are considered to be a hybrid legislature, so we aren't fully part-time, we aren't fully full-time. And on the odd years, the session is from January to June, so about half the year, and that is a longer session. They do a few more things there, but on the even-numbered years, it only goes from February to May. Again, not too much shorter, but slightly shorter, and again, it's just that kind of first half of the year. And the salary is $28,000 a year for both the senators and the representatives, so it's one that's usually supplemented with another income. It's not really exclusively their job in most cases. They'll have some other job as well that they do in addition to being a state legislator. Before we move on, something that you may hear about is this concept of a special session. And that would be a time when the legislature convenes to pass some law, do something that is outside of these normal session windows. So last year, I know the governor wanted to get tolls passed. That didn't happen during the regular session, so there was talk of calling a special session to take care of that. It didn't happen. And this year, the session kind of got cut short in March because of the coronavirus and the lockdowns that ensued. So there is also talk of convening for a special session this year to finish up the business because there wasn't really much legislation that was passed because things got cut so short. That can be called by the legislature or by the governor, so stay tuned on that. If we look at the state Senate, we have these 36 districts. Each one is about 100,000 people. And they're divided by members of the state legislature after every census. So we have a census every 10 years. 2020 will have a census. We'll see how the population is split. And then the legislators who are in power will form a joint committee and they will divide everything up. It doesn't usually change too much each year, but this is how it looks. The districts are going to be combinations of a few towns for the most part. Some are really big if the towns are not very densely populated, like over here on the sides. And then in the middle, you see where there are a lot of cities, around Hartford, around New Haven, around Bridgeport. There are some really tiny districts just because 100,000 people doesn't really go very far. And again, here we can just see the breakdown. 22 Democrats, 14 Republicans. To pass something, usually you'll need a simple majority, which is just over half. And here is where they meet. This is in the state capitol. So again, the offices are in the legislative building. They come here and they sit in this big circle, and that is where they'll formally meet. And just to look at the leadership, it does not look too different from the leadership of the U.S. Senate. So we have a president, and the president is the lieutenant governor, and that is the ultimate presider over the chamber and the tie-breaking vote in the case of a tie. This is so similar to the vice president being the president of the U.S. Senate. And again, you also have this president pro temp, and that is elected by the Senate. It is a senior member of the majority party. And then you'll also have the majority and the minority leaders who are in charge of each of their parties, and they kind of set the agenda. One interesting thing is Len Fasano, who is the minority leader, will be stepping down. This was his last session, so the Republicans are going to need to elect a new leader after this coming election in 2020. Now to look at the House of Representatives, this map is a lot more of a patchwork quilt, I guess, and you have some really tiny districts and some really big ones, just because they're only about 23,000 people each. A lot of the time, that is only part of a town, so you'll have a town that has multiple within it, but other times it can be a few towns, again, if they're pretty rural, if they're pretty sparsely populated, just to show how different they can be. We see here the city of Bridgeport has 6 districts within it, so one city sends 6 representatives to the House. On the other hand, out in eastern Connecticut, we have this 47th district, which has over 6 towns that are together within it. And again, we have the Democrats controlling it over the Republicans. And here is where they meet. It looks more like an auditorium. They all have a desk, and there is a big desk up front that they all look towards. There's a Speaker of the House who will belong to the majority party. And then there also is a majority leader and a minority leader. One interesting thing is Joe Arsemowicz and Themis Clarities both also stepping down after this session. It's up to the legislators who are elected after this 2020 election to vote on who they want their leadership to be. So even though we as voters will vote them in, once they're there, they also have votes to worry about to elect the people that they want to lead them. You may be wondering, who is your legislator? If you just search Find My Legislators CT, or you could just put a different state afterwards if you don't live in Connecticut, you'll find the website of whatever the state legislature is, and there will be some feature where you can type your address in and find out who it is. Address, again, is important. You can't really do it by town because some towns have multiple, they're split up. The address is the easiest way to pinpoint exactly. But if you do want to look by town, there is an option here. If you care about other towns like I do, you could just see this list and it'll lay out all of them, the town and who represents. And you'll see certain towns like Bethel right here will have multiple. That's where the address really comes in handy. One way to find your legislators quite literally is just looking at their license plates. They get these special plates. It'll say the years in the corner, and it'll say their district as well. So if you're walking through a parking lot and you see one of these, you know there is a state legislator nearby. I personally have seen this on multiple occasions. I've gotten pretty excited about it. But what's so interesting here is the lack of distance between the people and their representatives. So your representative could be a neighbor, it could be somebody who lives in the next neighborhood over, it could just be someone who lives in your town or someone who lives in the next town over. In any of these cases, you can reach them easily, you can talk to them if you want, you can message them on Facebook. It's not like the representatives you send to Washington, which you have difficulty reaching if you ever try to call their office, and they're always surrounded by so much security. They are very accessible at the state level. So now we're just going to go through the process of how state laws are made. And it is kind of complicated. I'm going to boil it down to this 4-step process. And my goal right here is not to acquaint you with every little detail, but more to just show you how, as a citizen, you can understand this process and you can watch it happen if you are concerned with seeing where your legislator has stood on some big issues, how to find that, and how to see what they voted on. All of that is very easy to do once you understand how this works. Before we're going to jump in, we need to just go over the difference between committees and caucuses, which are the two big kinds of groups that legislators form once they are elected. Committees are assigned, and they deal with different areas of subject matter. We'll see what they are. But when you have bills that are introduced, they'll always fall into some category as to what they pertain to, and the committee is the really specialized group that'll need to look at it and evaluate it and move it forward before it can be taken up by the entire House or the entire Senate. These are bipartisan. They include both Republicans and Democrats. They're also joint, so they have both senators and representatives, and the membership is mandatory. And then we have these caucuses, and they're just groups of legislators, also joint, that share legislative priorities. So in making laws, all of these legislators will have a common objective, they'll have a common cause, whether that be a partisan cause like Republican, Democrat, conservative, or progressive, or a more demographic one. So you'll have a women's caucus, a Black and Puerto Rican caucus. These demographic ones are made up of both Republicans and Democrats who come together to try to advance legislation that will benefit these groups, whereas the partisan ones will be more to advance party goals, because the different parties will have different agendas, and even within the parties you see the more conservative and the more progressive will have other agendas themselves. Caucuses allow them to form these groups, meet, talk, and plan, and try to advance these agendas and get what they want done. I'm going to be showing a bit of how this works out in practice. And we're going to be looking a lot at the Connecticut General Assembly's website, which you can find at cga.ct.gov. If you look at this banner up here, you see all of the tabs that will show you very valuable information that is easy to access. Representation just shows who the representatives are, as we just looked at. You can check out the committees, the different committees, who is on them. You can look at the statutes, which are laws that have already been passed, and then you also have this bill info right here, which can allow you to track and view the history of these bills as they go through the process of trying to become laws. So now we're going to get started, and the way that a bill gets started is with an idea. So every law starts with a bill, and a bill starts as an idea. And these bills can only be introduced by members of the state legislature, but the ideas can really come from anywhere. So you, as a citizen, can talk to your legislator and say, I think we should have this, I think we should do this, I think this should become a law. And they can then go through the process of introducing it, which is called sponsoring it, and moving it through the process as the sponsor to try and get it passed. After it's introduced by one of these legislators, then it goes to the clerk's office. And again, that is an example of a staff, a standing staff, a nonpartisan staff that just works in the state legislature, and they'll number it. So if it's introduced by a member of the House of Representatives, it'll start with HB and then have a number. And if it's introduced by a member of the Senate, then it's just SB and then that number. And at this point, it's called a proposed bill. It's been proposed, and it's then sent to the committee phase. So before we go to the committee phase, just to share an example, in case you're wondering what these laws can be, one that went through this process last year was one regarding helium balloons. So the idea that it started with was that it should be illegal to intentionally release helium balloons into the air. So it did become a proposed bill. It was introduced by Representative Irene Haynes, a member of the House of Representatives, and it's pretty simple at this point. It's not written in legal jargon yet. But then, as it goes to the committee phase, we see here this is referred to the Committee on Environment. All of these proposed bills will get shuffled along. And these are all of the different permanent committees that we have. You can just take a look. They pretty much cover anything that laws can pertain to. And the committee leaders will receive kind of these stacks of proposed bills, and it's up to them to filter through. It's called screening them, and they'll see what they want to devote attention to or what they don't really want to move forward on. And they can select certain ones and write them up in legal language, so it's not as simple as that balloon bill was we just saw then. They'll rework it, they'll make it look like a law, essentially, and then it becomes a committee bill. These bills not selected can just die and not move forward, or the committees can just hold on to them and use the ideas in a different way. So here, this is that same balloon bill, and here is how it looks different when it's made into a committee bill. So bills can be introduced at this phase as well. They don't all need to start in that proposed bill phase, and that works through a raised bill. Now, this raised bill is just introduced by a committee itself. So it's not an individual legislator or a group of legislators who bring it to the committees. The committees themselves can just create it themselves. And one that received a lot of attention this year before the session had to kind of end was one about immunizations and making them mandatory for public schooling. And we don't need to be concerned too much with the actual content of this bill. However, you see the number here. You can go read more about it if you're interested. Basically, what this looked to do was, if passed, it would have removed a certain exemption that currently exists that parents can claim if they do not want to give their children certain vaccinations before sending them to school. Before we can move through the committee phase, there is this concept of public hearings that happen at the committee level, and that is where the committees get opened up to other government officials and members of the public, and they can come provide testimonies to say why they think that it should become a law or why they think it should not be. And this is really cool because it is a way that the public can participate. You can go to the state capitol, you can prepare a little speech, and you can actually stand before the legislators who belong to the committee and just say why you think that it should be one way or another if you're really passionate about it. And why this vaccine bill is so important is because it attracted a huge movement of citizens who came to the public hearings back in February, and they packed the state capitol, and there was just hours, I think over 23 hours of testimonies that these committee members had to sit through because there was such passion, mostly passion against it, but also some for it. And that is just a really interesting option that we have. So if you ever hear about a bill that you feel passionately about, this is an option. You can go testify. And after that, then the committee kind of goes up to a vote, and they decide what they want the future of this bill to be. So if after these public hearings they maintain that they want it to go forward, they just issue a joint favorable report, which is nicknamed as JFing. It sounds kind of like a swear. It's not a swear. It's just to JF a bill means to move it forward past the committee phase. You can defeat it, or you can just take no action. And another thing that can happen is some bills will require multiple committees to sign off on it before they can go to the entire houses, and they'll just refer it to another committee here. That other committee does not need to go through the public hearing phase. There are a few administrative hoops that it needs to jump through before it gets voted on, and here they are. It has to go through the Legislative Commissioner's Office, the Office of Financial Analysis, the Office of Legislative Research. It'll get put on the calendars, and again, these are examples of standing staffs, not legislators, but people who work in the state legislature. Now, after it goes through that and it's put on the calendar, it'll begin in the House of Origin. So if it's introduced by a representative, it will go to the House of Representatives first, because that is the House of Origin. It'll become a matter that everybody needs to be a part of, and they can pass it, they can reject it, or they can amend it. They can look to make changes to it before it can move on to the other house. And once it goes to the other house, it does need to be passed as well. But again, they do have these other options to reject or amend also. And if amended, the big thing here is both houses are going to need to agree on the specific language. So if these amendments are proposed, you're going to need to have both houses sign off on the bill with the proposed amendments. Then that's when it can move forward, and it'll move forward to the governor. To see how this process happens, we can look at the bill history. So with this helium balloon bill that we mentioned, you can see the timeline here. You can see when it was passed by the House, and it was passed without amendments. And then it goes on to the Senate. The Senate actually never voted on it last year, so it didn't make it farther than that. But this was a bill that received a lot of agreement among legislators, even among both parties. So you have 123 voting yay and 12 voting nay. And of those voting yay, you have both Republicans and Democrats, and also of those voting nay, you do too. So it went and passed pretty easily, but that is pretty rare. And we can see how rare that is by comparing it to a case that never passes that easily, and that is the state budget, which also begins as a bill. You can see this is last year's budget. It was introduced by, if you notice these four names and you have a good memory, those are the Democrat leaders from both the House and the Senate. So this is the budget that was proposed by the Democrats. And it looks like this. I mean, if you just check out the bill itself, it has all of these categories and how much money will be sent to it, how that money is going to be obtained. And if you just look down here, 580 pages. So this is a really lengthy bill, and there is a lot of room to object to the things that are included within it. And because of that, so we see here all of these different amendments that were scheduled and voted on before you actually have the passage. And they happened in a very short period of time, so I imagine it was very stressful for our legislators trying to get this passed before the session ended. And you can actually look through on the General Assembly's website and look at all of these different amendments. You can see exactly what was proposed, if you're interested, and you can also see the votes. And you can see all of these ones that are not boxed in are ones where there were amendments that were not passed. The ones that we have circled here are the ones that did get passed, to get it moved forward, and were kind of the final votes on our budget. You can see exactly who voted for or against. And in this case, we don't have this resounding support as we did for the balloon bill. These are the breakdowns, and as we can see in both the House and the Senate, all Republicans voted against the budget, and even some Democrats did, but the yes votes were all Democrats, and we saw that this was that Democrat proposed budget, which makes sense because they do have the power to pass even without all of their party members signing off. If we had a narrower margin, then it would have been a lot more difficult to get it done. And more compromise probably would have needed to be made. And next up, the final stage is it goes to the governor. Now, we're going to talk about the governor in greater depth in our next lesson, but just to see where it can go from here, the governor has three options: to sign, to veto, which means to reject, or to take no action. If he signs it, then it becomes a law. Technically, it becomes a public act until it can be codified, which means kind of written into our laws. Also, vetoing will defeat unless you can get 2/3 of both houses to overturn it. And then if the governor takes no action, then it'll just become a law. It'll be after 5 days if this happens during the session, or after 15 days if it reaches after adjournment. So I hope this was a good introduction to how a bill becomes law at the state level and just what state legislatures are and how they differ based on the different states. Next up, as I said, we're going to look at the governor and the lieutenant governor. So thank you. Another big little lesson completed. And I promise that the next one will not come after such a long hiatus. Thank you.